It's Friday night. I'm Michael Walker. You're watching Tisky Sour with me and Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very good, Michael. How are you keeping? Well?
Very well. We have an absolutely jam-packed show for you tonight. More stories than I think we've ever done on a live show. We're going to talk about Jacob Rees-Mogg's stupidest idea yet. There have been a few, but this one does top them. British Airways at loggerheads with Unite. Labour's Jonathan Reynolds sparks a Twitter row. Me and Aaron revisit the strategic value of riots. And finally, we speak to Juliet Jacques on 10 years of trans representations in Britain's mainstream press. As always, tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskySour. We love to see them. We read them out during the show and share the show link so more people watch the live stream. Our first story, though, requires us to go back to the 11th of March. Let's take a look at Matt Hancock at that day's Downing Street press briefing.
I just want to absolutely underline the same point, which is that we follow the science, and the science on the use of face masks says that they don't have a material impact outside of those settings which the Public Health England have set out.
Fast forward 2 months, this is Grant Shapps speaking yesterday.
As of Monday, the 15th of June, face coverings will become mandatory on public transport. That doesn't mean surgical masks, which we must keep for clinical settings. It means the kind of face covering you can easily make at home.
That's right. It's taken 2 months for Britain to move from a position of saying masks aren't at all necessary to saying that actually they're essential and you have to wear them on public transport. That's despite, well, over the last 2 months, the tubes have never stopped moving, essential workers have never stopped going to work, and a month ago, Boris Johnson encouraged even non-essential workers to start taking the train and going back to their workplaces. I mean, in fact, he obviously covered his back by saying try not to get the train, but without any alternative means of getting to work, a lot of people will have been breathing in and out on London's underground and buses around the country. This also puts us way behind the rest of Europe. So let's get this up. So this is the dates that masks were made mandatory in our European neighbours. So on March the 18th, Czech Republic was the first country to make masks mandatory on public transport and in shops. On March the 25th, Slovakia followed suit. On April the 6th, Austria made masks mandatory in all public spaces. On Germany, on April the 22nd, they made them mandatory in public transport and in shops. Then on May the 10th, France made masks mandatory in all public spaces, and Spain followed suit on May the 20th. In the UK, again, an outlier, masks will be made mandatory on public transport on June the 15th. Now we've realised it's essential. We aren't even doing it straight away. I cannot work out why we're waiting 10 days to do it after we've worked out that the science makes it necessary, but there you go. It has thus happened with lockdown. It happened with quarantine, and now it's happening with masks. Why is it always the case that the UK government falls into line with the policies that our neighbours have adopted, but a month too late? Aaron, tell me what's going on here. I can't see how the same thing happens again and again and again. In a pandemic situation where acting very quickly is one of the most important aspects of policymaking. The government does everything weeks and weeks after it's been clear to anyone with a modicum of common sense that it was a necessary measure to try and reduce the transmission and effects and impacts of coronavirus.
I mean, it's almost like they're trying to make it as bad as possible. It's almost like they're trying to ensure as many people as possible contract the coronavirus. Because if you look at countries like Vietnam, Thailand, very few cases. I think in Vietnam, no fatalities, registered fatalities as a result of coronavirus. It's a neighbor of China, obviously a low-income country, not super poor, but it's not got a high GDP like a European country. And the reason why they did well was because they implemented very quickly things which don't cost anything, like face masks, like quarantine. It makes no sense for us to have done what we've done so late. There's one country, it's not in Europe, you haven't mentioned it, naturally, Japan. I think in early April, I think around April 2nd, they said they were going to send 2 face masks to each household in the country. So around 50 million households in Japan. That was the 2nd of April. And I just don't get, we were having these conversations at the beginning of April, end of March. why don't we just say to everybody, you have to wear a mask? What's the downside? Where's the problem in being cautious? It won't make any difference. Well, okay. The other side of the coin is thousands more people will die unnecessarily. And it just seems so odd. You know, we could have done lockdown earlier. We could have done the masks in April. We could have done quarantine. We would have, you know, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not going to say we could have had half the deaths. We could have had significantly fewer deaths with low cost or free, or even in the case of quarantine, it may be revenue raising measures. And people, again, it feeds into the ideological thing. How can you enforce it? You find people. Oh, we haven't got the people to do it. What do you think the police do? You know, we have parking officers that do parking fines all day. Only 15,000 flights a week coming into the UK for the last couple of months, and it's a really hard thing to work out. Is it ideology? Possibly. Is it just brazen incompetence? Possibly. I think finally it does feed into the worldview of Dominic Cummings is actually you shouldn't do what you think you should do. You should do the thing you don't think you should do, which is like, oh, actually masks are bad. Actually quarantine is bad. And it's like, okay, because these people don't believe in planning. They think if you plan, that's the worst possible thing because, you know, they come out of the kind of Hayek, Friedmanite, the market always knows, planning's always, human cognition is incapable of top-down, authoritative, competent planning. That's their MO. So I think that must be the only explanation. I mean, how else would you explain it, Michael?
I mean, I think that point's really valuable, actually. So it's very famous that David Cameron, when he asked Dominic Cummings to resign from his old job working for Michael Gove, or I think probably Michael Gove had to sack him, he described Dominic Cummings as a career psychopath. But here it seems potentially that we're being led by a career contrarian. You know, the obvious thing to do that everyone else is doing, we just keep not doing for some kind of unexplained reason. So actually, in that Matt Hancock clip that I showed you later on in that answer, what he explains is that the reason we're not going to make masks mandatory or even encourage them at all is one, we don't have the evidence to say whether or not it stops transmission. Even though, you know, all of these other countries thought, well, we might as well get people to wear them because it seems like, and what we know now, and I think what many people knew then, to be honest, is that a non-medical mask doesn't do much to stop you catching coronavirus, but it can do quite a lot to stop you spreading it because it sort of catches your aerosols closer to your, well, next to your mouth. They don't go out into the train or into the shop or wherever you are. And he said that we don't know this, and also we don't want to create shortages for the masks that people in medical situations need. Now, this was another situation, much like when they said we can't close schools because then kids will have to go with their grandparents if their parents have to go to work in the NHS, for example. There's a very simple solution, which is you say, why don't you make your own masks? Just like with the schools, it's why don't you say the schools open only for people who work for essential workers? There's always a really simple fix that the government doesn't work out for like 2 months. Very strange, very odd. And in the case of the lockdown, I mean, I think it was Dominic Cummings being a career contrarian. That's why they went for herd immunity so enthusiastically and said that all these countries going for a lockdown, they were just populists, employing policies that made no scientific sense, even though it turned out that they absolutely did. But it was also, they wanted to delay the lockdown because they were saying we're going for herd immunity. We want enough people to catch coronavirus before we do the lockdown. And I mean, we're told they're not going for herd immunity anymore, but then why are we still waiting for people to get masks? Do we want enough people to catch coronavirus on the tube before we start making people wear masks? It doesn't, the delay, I can't see any logic for it whatsoever. Another point actually that's important to note in terms of if you want the opposite of being reassured on the government's approach to coronavirus, we found out today that stats from Public Health England and Cambridge University said that the reproduction rate of the virus is now above 1 in both the Northwest and the Southwest. This follows on from the government over and over again telling us the one condition for easing the lockdown is that R stays below 1. Now it's over it, and we're still, you know, basically rushing through the process of easing all of the enforced extreme social distancing measures that were in place for most of March and April and much of May. Aaron,
did you see the sort of? I was watching sort of BBC 6 o'clock news, and the way this was just being reported on. Oh well, the rate of infection is going down. Yeah, no shit. We've had a lockdown for 2.5 months. I would hope it's going down, but like you say, the R rate in many parts of the country is above 1. Even if it's, you know, it wasn't that long ago, the government was saying the target's 0.5. So even if it's just close to 1, which it's been for weeks, you know, the fatalities has basically plateaued now. for about 10 days, really. And when you say plateau, it's flattening the curve. That's, the implicit thing when it's being talked about by the media and by the government. That's a good thing. No, we don't want it to plateau at 350. We want it to plateau at like 10 or 5. And I'm sure many of our viewers yesterday saw that incredible image. There was a map that was shared. If they haven't seen the map, it's just been doing the rounds as a soundbite. More people died in Britain yesterday because of coronavirus than the rest of the European Union put together. Greece is a very, very poor country now by the standards of Western Europe. It's a Western European country. It's one of the lowest GDP per capita Western European countries, right? Greece and Portugal. They're approaching Central European kind of GDP per capita, primarily because of the sovereign debt crisis and so on. Greece is half as wealthy as Britain per head, and obviously it's got a population around a fifth of the size. They're not letting us in, right? We're one of the countries where they won't accept tourists from. So how you're dealing with this, how you're responding with an effective political solution has very little to do with how affluent you are. But still, we have a media which is trying to put a gloss on this. Today is the day we went over 40,000. Yesterday, we have more deaths than the rest of the European Union put together. The facts are horrendous. And that's not really being conveyed, I think, in the accounts that you see, particularly on the BBC. And that's not BBC bashing. 80% of broadcast news in this country comes from the BBC. If they're going to do their job properly, I think they should probably say the government has some serious questions to answer.
Going to go to a couple of comments. Rachel Grigg says, if they make it mandatory everywhere, the whole school's back things falls apart. Is that because students will... I'd have thought they could just tell kids and teachers to wear the face mask, but I'm not sure quite what the logic there is, but I'm sure there is some. It's a shame it's not a phone-in show. Otherwise, I could have asked that directly. Simon Duane tweets on the hashtag #TiskiSour, judge the government by their actions couldn't be better designed to maintain a high but constant rate of new coronavirus cases above 5,000 per day without the number overwhelming ICU capacity in the NHS. That's the argument they're still going for, that flatten the curve, slow herd immunity strategy. I agree. There is quite a lot of evidence for that. We will have to wait and see.
Can I come in quickly, Michael?
Yes, Aaron.
Another thing was, again, I was just watching the BBC News before we came on, and the guy says, "Oh, there's a slight increase in the number of people who've died in terms of excess deaths, have died from dementia last month. A slight increase." No, it was approximately 80%, and dementia is the number one cause of death in this country. It's higher than heart disease. It's higher than cancer. It's higher than stroke. It's the leading cause of death in this country, and it just increased in 1 month by approximately 80%. And this was just some afterthought. Really concerning. Really, really concerning.
We've got over 1,500 watching. I know it's a Friday night, but pubs aren't open. So let's get above 2,000 tonight. So please share the stream. Tweet about it on the hashtag #TiskiSour. Jacob Rees-Mogg has some pretty reactionary views, from climate skepticism to opposition to abortion. But his latest political intervention is not so much right-wing as downright stupid. So the context: since the coronavirus lockdown, MPs have for the first time been able to intervene in debates and vote remotely from home. The system worked well. MPs didn't need to traverse the country potentially spreading the virus, and MPs in vulnerable categories would be able to shield. But there was a problem. Boris Johnson didn't like standing up at PM queues without a jeering crowd behind him. When the room was silent, all of his personal inadequacies were far more on show. So in order to reintroduce the public school jeering that makes him feel so good, so comfortable, so big in himself, Rees-Mogg has called for Parliament to be convened in person once again. That happened this week, and we saw some pretty ridiculous scenes as MPs were forced to queue at a 2-meter distance in a line which was over 1 kilometer long. Let's look at some of the images from that moment here. So there was a 90-minute queue. These are people. These are quite well-paid people, so their time is somewhat valuable. This is what the queue looked like. So it's kind of like an airport. They've turned that huge historic building into one big queue. Goes everywhere. We can see people queuing in a next image, I think. Yeah, so that's it full with the people. And that's them standing outside. They had to use every single part of the parliamentary estate. And unfortunately, it didn't seem like they were able to socially distance. Let's look here at the MPs, not quite managing to keep 2 meters apart. Now, this is already ridiculous. It means that MPs have to traverse across the country. Obviously, MPs have 2 homes, one in their constituents and one in London. If we don't want coronavirus to be spreading from low infection places to high infection places, it's probably better to avoid huge travels from across the whole nation. Also, you're going to get quite a lot of people, often older people, in a small space. Ridiculous. But it got even worse, in fact, when Alok Sharma, the business secretary, stood up in Parliament on Wednesday and showed a certain set of symptoms.
Will have retrospective effect so as to provide as much relief to businesses as possible. And where this is the case, we have already announced dates from which the measures will start. So let me turn to corporate restructurings. This is the permanent corporate restructurings package of measures, which have previously been consulted on. As colleagues will know, these measures were consulted on back in 2016.
So, I mean, government advice is to self-isolate as soon as you get any kind of symptoms. So Alok Sharma, the business secretary, he often leads the Downing Street briefings, is standing there in the Commons chamber with a bunch of MPs, often very old, all of them supposedly traveling to their constituencies on the weekend. And he's there wiping his brow, sweating. The guy looks really ill. And he looks really ill with a fever, which is what you're supposed to self-isolate for. So once that image went out, Alok Sharma had to go into self-isolation. The whole of Westminster completely freaked out. It turned out that Alok Sharma hadn't got coronavirus. He tested negative. And apparently, he'd just eaten some dodgy salmon. But this shows how, I mean, vulnerable they all are now, and how, I mean, the central institution of our state is ready to collapse the moment someone gets a fever, because Jacob Rees-Mogg wanted some people cheering in the background when Boris Johnson has to face Keir Starmer at PMQs. Aaron, you couldn't make it up.
No, it's like, you know, there's sort of like action films, and they're like the president and the vice president can never be on the same plane. Otherwise, that's also actually true, because obviously you need a commander in chief. If one of them dies, well, if the president dies, the vice president's somewhere else, and he can, you know, there's an element of continuity with the running of the state. You know, what basically Jacob Rees-Mogg has done here is voluntarily put the entire legislature in a particular area and subject them to potentially the equivalent of a low-grade biological weapon. You know, people were worried 15 years ago about anthrax attacks and anthrax going through, justifiably, through people's letterboxes and so on in the aftermath of 9/11. Honestly, this is no different. Like, an MP could die because of this. An MP could be hospitalized. I mean, statistically, it's quite likely that a staffer will be hospitalized as a result of this. And for what? And like you said, it's for a few cheers. That's what we know in it. People saying, oh, it will play well with the Daily Mail. No, if people start going to hospital, it won't. And I think here's a few things. Firstly, if you've got an MP and you've made a complaint, or you're trying to get help from them, you've not heard from them, and you see them wasting their time for 2-3 hours doing nothing, you're thinking, wow. I mean, that is such a gift for Labour at the next general election on the doorstep. You have a Tory MP. Oh, yeah, you know, he hasn't been, because they care more about queuing and virtue signalling to the Daily Mail than to helping you out. That's the first thing. Then secondly, you know, we've often been saying, as has much of the British media, well, Britain's GDP per capita per hour, its productivity hasn't moved for around 12 years. And we've called this the productivity puzzle. Why can't Britain produce more working the same? Basically, the same amount of work has produced the same amount of output for about 12 years. That's not meant to happen normally with capitalism. It's not really happened for about 200 years. And when you see Jacob Rees-Mogg making people line up like lemmings in Westminster to form a mile-long queue, you probably then begin to suspect the reason why we haven't had increased productivity for the last 12 years is because these idiots are running the country. You know, is it any surprise we've got flatlining productivity when, you know, the political imperative here is to make people stand in the heat doing nothing and be subject to the equivalent of a low-grade biological weapon? That just so you get maybe a good page 3 in the Daily Mail. That's the people running this country. That's why Britain increasingly, in many aspects, including coronavirus, resembles a developing country. I don't like to say it, But that's because, that's explicable because people like Jacob Rees-Mogg have these political priorities. And you have to wonder, how far will it go?
I mean, the thing to note is you said it like a hypothetical. An MP could be hospitalized or could die. I mean, this isn't a wild thing to speculate about because the Prime Minister nearly died. He got coronavirus. He had to go to ICU. The guy nearly died. And now all of these people from the same demographic as him are being forced to go into a really old building, small corridors. I doubt it's particularly well ventilated, just because Boris Johnson wants some people behind him to make some positive noises. Bizarre. And it's not just their health that is at risk. It is their constituents, because you are having people who are coming into London. They're traveling into the Houses of Parliament. They're standing quite close to people in those queues, as you saw in that image. And then they're going to be going back to their constituencies. Maybe they're driving, maybe they're taking the train. We don't know, but presumably for an MP to do their job, they're going to end up meeting quite a lot of people out and about. And I mean, the serious point here, because I do think this is partly about Boris Johnson wanting people in the background when he faces Keir Starmer, but it is also, and probably more fundamentally, that what the Conservatives want to do is to force people back into their workplaces, even if it's unsafe. So the whole point of easing the lockdown the way that Boris Johnson wanted to do it, the way he has done it, is he's saying, look, even if you feel a bit unsafe going into work, even if you can't keep the 2-meter rule, even if it feels a bit dangerous, you should do it anyway. And also, even if you think you might be able to work from home, even if it seems completely unreasonable for your boss to demand you come in, potentially because he wants to oversee you working because he doesn't think that you're disciplined enough working from home. If your boss wants to do it, even if it's a crazy, ridiculous idea, you should still do it. So, I mean, they are leading by example in a way, because the example they want to set is, even if it seems completely irrational and completely dangerous to go into work, you should do it anyway. That's the message they're sending out. And Boris Johnson, he's already immune. Matt Hancock, he's already immune. So they are willing to, they're safe. So what they're willing to do is risk the health of all the MPs in Parliament and all their constituents, purely to prove a point, which is that even if you don't want to go to work feeling unsafe, you should do it. They want you to do that to help businesses begin to make profits again, and so that they can reduce the cost of the furlough, etc., etc. But it's bad for public health. It's bad for MPs' health. And the reason they're doing it is, I mean, disgraceful, quite frankly. Aaron, do you want to come back in on this before we go to our next topic?
I guess there's the final point that, there's the final point, I guess, of, you're sending kids back to school. You're telling teachers they have to go back to work. And it's about universalizing that, say, well, we can't, and it would look terrible to say that teachers have to go back to teaching children, but MPs won't return to Parliament. On the one hand, yes, it would. On the other hand, there was a system for this one particular workplace which worked really well, and yeah, I mean, Christ, the conversations have already started. Well, the post-coronavirus economy will be more honest about the advantages of remote working, and maybe we can move to a 3-day week in the office and 2 at home. And well, not if you're Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Craig Evans tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, my local MP Angela Eagle had a go at him about it, Rees-Mogg, I assume, calling for his resignation. His rebuttal was to say that MPs were overreacting. It's a very Rees-Mogg thing to say. Reminds me of, him saying, well, it's slightly different, but it reminds me of him saying that people in Grenfell should use their common sense. It's a very dismissive attitude. Who cares about health and safety? Why are people complaining? They should just do their own thing, which is similar to what he's saying right now. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the like button. That increases subscribers. We've got 2,000 watching, 2,000 people watching, 500 likes. Let's get that to at least over 1,000 while we're live. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. We want to increase our subscribers, and it means that every time we go live. Tisky Sour is live every Monday night, Wednesday night, and Friday. And Aaron Bastani has a brilliant interview show, The Bastani Factor, every Tuesday. Definitely check out his interview with Alex Vitali on the end of policing this week. So one of the hardest hit industries from coronavirus has been airlines, aviation. Now, some of our audience might think that's a good thing. Obviously, aviation is a very polluting industry. But for the 12,000 British Airways employees who now face redundancy, BA have said they're going to cut 12,000 jobs. Obviously, the struggles of that industry has material and awful effects on them. Very stressful time. Unite the Union is currently in battle with British Airways, who have received shed loads of government money, but now are promising to cut loads of jobs before they see what happens next. They're in a battle with them. Howard Beckett is their Assistant General Secretary representing BA staff, and he is joining me this evening. Howard Beckett,
Evening,
thank you
Michael.
for your time.
Not at all. Evening. How are you?
Yeah, very well.
Good.
Can you tell me the latest developments? You're sort of in tough negotiations at the moment with British Airways, aren't you?
Yes, or a tough standoff, whichever way you want to put it at the moment. So British Airways have indicated that they intend to make 42,500 people redundant on the 15th of June. And then they'll be kind enough to offer 30,000 of them new contracts on vastly reduced terms and conditions, extraordinary reductions in wages for some up to 60-70% reductions in wages. They'll be allowed back into the company as if the company is a low-cost airline, made to work on contracts that have seasonal clauses, without the terms and conditions, without the collective agreements that we've negotiated, and 12,500 will be without a job. And the 12,500 will be selected against the terms of the redeployment agreement that we negotiated with British Airways some time ago, and saw us through the financial crisis and saw us through 9/11. So just disgraceful vandalism on the part of Willie Walsh and Alex Cruz, tearing their own company apart, going to war with their own employees, all for the sake of some Darwinian capitalism, some idea that there'll be last company standing in the sector whenever this crisis is over and done with. Absolutely disgraceful.
Oh, so that's that. So it's the 42,000 figure. So it's not just 12,000 they're going to make redundant. They're going to make everyone redundant and then rehire 30,000 people on worse terms.
Fire and hire is their terms, Michael. Fire and hire.
I wanted to know sort of how, I mean, your job, especially as a trade unionist, as a negotiator, how does coronavirus affect this? Because obviously what you'd expect when an employer is doing something as outrageous as this is the employees would go on strike, but many of them are furloughed. Planes are barely moving. So does coronavirus put you in a particularly weak position to fight against what seemed like some pretty draconian, unreasonable proposals from the employer?
Well, this was obviously what was in the thought of Willie Walsh. It certainly wasn't morality that was in his thought process. This is a man who was quite prepared to take the taxpayers' money for furlough, see all of his employees, majority of his employees go out on that furlough, so as the government and the taxpayers paying for their wage, and then issue statutory redundancy notices with the minimum period of time, 45 days. And obviously as a union, our intent is to meaningfully consult with our members. That's what we're required to do by statute. The employer is required to allow us that. And the employer is required to allow us access to people. Well, obviously we cannot meaningfully consult with 42,000 people when the vast majority of them are furloughed, a furlough scheme that prevents them from working. So you would expect any consultation to be in the working hours. And obviously the statute requires us to have access to the workforce. And in any reasonable thought, we cannot have access to a workforce that is furloughed all corners of the countries under COVID conditions. Just complete opportunism on the part of Willie Walsh. But he's looked at this wrong. He's got this one wrong. He hasn't realised how angry the public will be. He hasn't realised how obvious and Machiavellian his tactics are. He hasn't realised that across political parties, MPs would reject this form of capitalism. And he hasn't realised that Unite will not back off. So we're making it very obvious to the entire nation and to all MPs that he should lose his slots at Heathrow if he's going to behave like this. He should lose the national flag because they will no longer be the brand that they project themselves as. They will be a low-cost airline looking to be a high brand airline at the same time, and that's entirely unreasonable. And he should certainly lose the furlough money that he's been paid for by the government in good faith, only to use the job retention scheme for the entire antithesis of what it's intended. It's not intended to run down the statutory clock on redundancies. This is disgraceful. It's the worst form of capitalism that you would ever see, Michael.
And finally, what do you want to see for the industry? Because I mean, obviously, it looks, the projections suggest that the airline industry isn't going to bounce back. As I suggested earlier, there'll be some people who think that the airline industry probably shouldn't bounce back for climate change reasons. So how do you see the possibility of protecting your members' workers' rights and defending their interests with the future of a sustainable, both financially and environmentally, aviation industry?
Well, obviously, aviation has a long-term, medium to long-term challenge in respect of environmental issues, and we're not blind to that. It's a reality that COVID, this crisis, has made us all realise that things such as the climate crisis are very real. Things that may well have seemed a distant prospect and very unlikely to happen are very real, and that's the lesson we all learned from COVID. So, as a union, we'll certainly be looking at that on an environmental case as and when we're through this crisis. But there's no need for Willie Walsh and British Airways to behave the way they are. It comes to something whenever Willie Walsh's conduct means that Ryanair looks like a standout employer in the sector. Michael O'Leary must think we're doing some damage to his reputation whenever we're quoting Ryanair as being an example as to how to treat your employees. But the truth is that Michael O'Leary himself has taken a pay cut. There's no sign of Willie taking any pay cut in respect of his £3 million a year, nor Alex Cruz in respect of his £1.4 billion a year. No reference to the £2 billion of profit that our members made for British Airways last year. Ryanair has said that those on the highest will take the biggest burden of the cut, and those on the lowest will take the lowest burden. And most importantly of all, Michael, he has benchmarked this and said that our members will have that money back as and when the industry returns to pre-COVID levels of business. And that's all that Willie Walsh has to show in order to satisfy us that he's not just being disingenuous and opportunistic. But of course he will not do that, because he is being opportunistic. He's trying to fight a fight that he lost with us 10 years ago, trying to take advantage of the fact that we do not have currently industrial action as an option for our members, and he's trying to make BA into the low-cost airline that he always wanted. But he should understand this. The public will not accept it. MPs will not accept it. He will end up losing the flag and losing slots. And as and when industrial action is available to us, it will not be industrial action that will go on for months. It will go on for years, because this is simply wrong. And Unite won't stand by and take it.
Howard Beckett, thank you so much for your time, and solidarity to you and your members from all of us at Novara Media.
Thanks very much, Michael.
We are now going to go on to our next story, which is about Labour's policy on welfare. So Jonathan Reynolds, who's Labour's new Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pension, sparked a row on Twitter today because of an interview he gave to Politics Home. So the accompanying article had this particular headline. This is what caused the outrage. Can we get this up? Exclusive: welfare should reflect what you put in to tackle public mistrust, says Labour's Shadow DWP Secretary. So this headline provoked cries that Labour were returning to the days of, talking about strivers and skivers and saying people are taking out stuff without putting it in, and we need to tackle this. And it's people read this basically as him chasing the Tories to the right on welfare. I think that this was somewhat of a misrepresentation and misses the point of his intervention. Aaron might disagree slightly, but we're going to go to a look at the offending quote in full first. So this is Jonathan Reynolds speaking to Politics Home. One of the reasons that support for social security has diminished amongst parts of the country is the sense that people put into the system and they don't get anything out of it. In a way, if you look at eligibility for universal credit, people are not wrong. You can make significant contributions to the system and find that actually you're not really eligible for any major support if you need it, even in a crisis like this one. I think you've got to recognise that that's a big problem for working people in the UK. He goes on. When you're looking at how you design or change the system going forward, certainly I feel if you have made greater contributions to the system, there is an argument that you should receive more out of that system. It doesn't mean you will ever be leaving people without support or leaving them destitute, but I simply feel that the lack of a connection between what you put in and what you get out has become a major problem of social security and the political support for it. So this was controversial because people think that, well, in a way, it's true. A contributory system gives people more money if they need it less, because if you've put more money into it, you've probably built up a few more assets. And then when you become unemployed or when you retire, you end up getting more back from the state than someone who's put less in. So it can seem like a system which gives more to people, which takes more from people according to their abilities, but then also gives back to people according to their abilities. So it's not. People don't think it's particularly socialist. I think there is a political economy argument as to why the contributory principle is very important, which I'll lay out in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to go to Aaron Bastani. What did you think about this particular interview?
Well, I'm interested in what you've got to say, Michael, because I was surprised when you laid out your thinking on this. And I do think the framing of, people are paying in but not getting anything back, I think is a very, very dangerous frame. Inevitably, in the labour market, there will be people who don't pay in, who may at some point require, unemployment benefit. If you're a mother, let's say you're a student, you go get a degree, you get a master's, for a couple of years, 2 years working, you take time out to have a couple of kids. You go get a job after, leaving the labour market for 4 years, and you become unemployed really quickly. You're laid off. That woman is going to be massively disadvantaged in the labour market on the basis of this principle than a male counterpart who just stayed on a job, straight after graduating and didn't take the time out to look after children. Equally, if somebody is engaged in higher education, let's say you do a master's, do a PhD, you then enter a job which is commensurate with your education. Let's say you become, a medical researcher or a mechanical engineer, which required a PhD for some reason, and you're 30 years old or 29 years old, and after 1 year on the job, you're let go. Again, you're being discriminated against because you didn't enter the labour market 5, 6, 7, 8 years earlier. Of course, you didn't do that because you've got qualifications which hopefully mean you add unique value in your job. And so I think it does discriminate against certain kinds of people. Women who want to raise children, take time out from work, people that stay in education, or people that maybe, immigrate here. And so they're a bit newer. Now, we need to have a conversation, obviously, with departure from the EU. Rights in that regard are changing too. But I think, generally speaking, the contributory principle can be a bit of a dangerous terrain here. I do think it does actively discriminate against certain parts of the labour market.
So the argument for it, I'll lay it out. And I agree with you in terms of fairness. If you had a set amount, if the state had a set amount of money that it had to distribute to the population, to people in need, then the fairest way to do that would be to give it to people who need it most. That's the argument for means testing. Basically, means testing, you say you give money to the people who need it most. There's a set pool of resources that the state has, and to give it to someone who doesn't particularly need it would be a waste of those resources. Now, the argument for a contributory system is a political economy one, which is to say that what you should try and do as a social democrat is build up public support for high taxation and a very expansive welfare state. And the way you do that is you get buy-in from all sections of society to that welfare state, to that social insurance system. And the reason, and the way you do that, is you have to crowd out private alternatives. So this was done by the Swedes in the 1970s. So you had a problem whereby the sort of basic rate of pensions and social security wasn't deemed adequate by the middle classes. They started opting out and moving into private pensions, private social insurance. And what the Swedes did to prevent that is they added sort of a two-tier system where everyone gets quite a generous basic level of social protection, be that unemployment benefit or pensions, but then you can also buy into a basically top-up scheme. And what that did was it completely suppressed the private pension system. And that meant that you get buy-in from the whole of society. You get much more support for a much higher level of taxation than you have in a country like the UK. And that system, which has middle-class people paying into this central social security pot, can have the kind of progressive policy outcome. So that money can be used for progressive ends to try and raise the base level in a way that money cannot if it slides out and middle-class people, to protect themselves, to hedge their bets against losing their jobs or getting old, invest it in private schemes, the stock market, or in property. So the argument for the contributory principle is that it is the only way that we've seen that you can build up sustainable and consistent support for a large welfare state, for high levels of taxation. And that means that ultimately you can have a basic level of benefits which is higher for all.
Do you mean pensions? Because you said pensions. I mean, the pensions debate is slightly different because actually
it's pensions and unemployment. So
we have a tidal wave coming in regards to pensions. Unemployment benefits are slightly different.
It's for both. So it's for cash transfers. So the argument I saw, any kind of aspect of the welfare state which is about cash transfers, it doesn't apply to services. So I saw when I made this argument on Twitter, someone was saying, well, this is like if you gave rich people more access to the NHS than poor people. The reason you don't need to do that is because to crowd out private healthcare, all you need to do is have a better healthcare system.
Well,
and the NHS.
But we don't have. I mean, we do have private pensions, and so I understand that argument there. But we don't have private providers of unemployment insurance.
Yeah, but what you have, so the argument that Jonathan Reynolds was making is that what people find who are on sort of middle incomes is that when if they ever find themselves needing universal credit, they go to it and they think this I cannot remotely maintain my standard of living here, which is precisely one of the reasons why there isn't a thing called private unemployment insurance, but there are many things which are basically private insurance schemes for either if you get old or if things go wrong, which is property, houses, right?
Yeah.
So you have many rich middle class people who look for second sources of income. Maybe they buy a buy-to-let house, or they put money in the stock market. There are many people doing
that's
that.
Not middle. I mean, the number of buy-to-let landlords is not that big. You do need, I think, 25% deposit for a buy-to-let mortgage. It's not like anybody can do it. To an extent, I can see where you're coming from with this, and I agree. But there's a lot of ways to disincentivize people moving into the property market. You could raise the deposit needed for a buy-to-let mortgage. You could raise the 35%, 40%. You could tax the capital gains on properties. If you don't live in a property and you sell it, there's a capital gains tax. You could increase that. There's loads of ways you could disincentivize cash transfer into real estate. I think we probably all agree on that.
It's also about support for that system, though, right? So it's also there's empirical evidence for this. If you look at support for high levels of distribution, you quoted it on Twitter.
Unemployment benefit in Germany, for instance, doesn't work it doesn't work on this kind of system. For instance, you could get a job in Germany. I think you need to work for, I don't think somebody in the comments will say it's less than a year. I think 9 months. And you get new entitlements the longer you've been in it. Yeah, and then you're given. But he's not saying that. He's saying what you put in. No, he's saying no. He literally says verbatim. We can probably pull it back up. What you put in is what you get out. That's what he's saying.
He doesn't say that verbatim.
You can have a threshold.
if he said that,
we can talk about
a problem.
We can talk about a threshold. Oh, you have to be in full-time work for 3 months, and then you get this. 6 months, you get this. That's no, because the contributory principle is premised not on how long you're working necessarily, but how much you're earning. Okay, that's the first thing. Well, but
it's not what you put in, is what you get out. Because there are still going to be loads of people who put in way more than they get out, and loads of people who put in nothing and still get out. Right?
If you're a mum on minimum, a mum who's entered the labour market late and then is in part-time work and she's on a minimum wage, you've put in barely anything, but you've put in loads of socially important work of raising children, which are future taxpayers, future carers,
and what you're
for an aging population. Where's their reward? So I think the contributory kind of principle,
their reward will be the same as it is now, but there'll be public support for it to be way more generous. So if everyone, and there's
nobody's defending the
state, right?
Nobody's defending the status quo. You're saying, the average compared to the universal credit, universal credit's terrible. Nobody's saying this will absolutely be an improvement on universal credit.
This is the point of a political economy argument, right? So a political economy argument is you say, how do we move to a system where there is public support for higher levels of base level benefits, right? Because we can all design an ideally fair system, a sort of John Rawls behind the invisible curtain. How do we design this ideally fair system?
Nobody's suggesting
people have done that and it doesn't get implemented. So what you have to do is design a system which is going to be sustainable, which means you need widespread buy-in. And what comparative studies of European welfare states has shown is that you get that widespread buy-in when you have universal services and a generous universal base level of benefits, but you also have an ability for people to top up their access to benefits with a contributory with
maybe let's get the quote up, because he literally says putting in.
Okay, get up the quote and you can find that quote.
Get these 2 pages up, Fox. Or Fox, he's thinking, oh god,
it's not in there.
Well, hold on, Fox, we can look on that. 1 sec. It's the next one. Here you go. When you're looking at how you design or change the system going forward, certainly I feel if you've made greater contributions to the system, there's an argument that you should receive more out of that system.
Yeah, that's not you get in what you put. So that's precisely what
you put more in, you get more out.
Yeah, you put more in, you get more out, but you don't get out what you put in. So there are going to be many people who get out more than they put in, and there are going to be many people who get out less than they put in. But you still have an association between a contributory principle. Obviously, any system which says you don't get
But in a social welfare system, disabled people, they don't put anything into the system.
Yeah, but that's you don't have to. So that's why he's saying you don't get out.
No, but the
exactly
principle
what you've put in, but you have a contributory principle. It's always a top up. Anyway, Fox is saying move on. Right, we're going to move on.
I think it's very easily lapses into the language of workfare. And I think, maybe it's not a huge issue. The point, he was so injudicious with his language. He was injudicious with his language, Michael.
Well, he wasn't. You've put words into his mouth that he didn't say.
I haven't. He said no.
He didn't say you get out
said,
what you put in. He did not say that. If he said that, it would be incredibly reactionary. That's not what he said. Oh, actually, what I did want to go before we could move on to our thing about riots is that whatever you think about the contributory principle, I just want to draw attention to one of the achievements of Corbyn as Labour leader. Yeah. So before Corbyn, under Ed Miliband, Reynolds' job was occupied by Rachel Reeves. Yes, she is now in the shadow cabinet in quite an important role, and that is worrying. But this was her major intervention when she was in charge of the work and pensions brief. Let's get this up. This is from 2013. Nobody should be under any illusions that they are going to be able to live a life on benefits under a Labour government, she said. If you can work, you should be working. And under our compulsory jobs guarantee, if you refuse that job, you forgo your benefits. And that is really important. Next graphic. It is not an either or question. We would be tougher than the Conservatives if they don't take it, which is the offer of a job. They will forfeit their benefit, but there will also be the opportunities there under a Labour government. So, I mean, what's really appalling there, why that is about the strivers and the scribers, is because she's saying the problem here is people are lingering on benefits. Nobody should be under any illusions that they're going to be able to live a life on benefits. So it's this idea that you have to, beat people basically with a stick to stop them taking benefits. You have to punish people to push them back into work, which is the workfare principle, which is the principle that George Osborne was pushing during the 2010s, but also the third way. Social Democrats often fell into this trap. Now, let's look after Corbyn. The political centre ground has completely moved, and Reynolds on this issue takes the opposite position. So on universal credit, he says, it is a system predicated on a very kind of Victorian attitude to poor people. The ethos of it is mean. It is something almost predicated on the idea that you've got to hit people with a stick to get them back into work. So that is, people who say Corbyn didn't achieve anything. You had the Labour Party pre-2015, which was saying we need to punish people back into work. We need to be tougher on unemployed people than the Tories. You have the Labour Party afterwards saying, no, you shouldn't beat people with a stick to get them back into work, right? And that also links back to our previous discussion, because I don't think a contributory system does necessarily, well, it doesn't, if you look at comparative welfare states, mean that you have a lower base level of unemployment benefit. It just doesn't comparatively, doesn't need to. Let's move on to our next topic. First of all, Oliver Kant comments, we should all just register as multinational corporations, then they'll definitely give us support then. That's a good point. And thank you for your super chat so far. We've got one from Rusty Sleeves with a 1066 super chat. You guys are keeping the show running. Thanks for keeping us sane. Spot on as always. Much better value than Netflix. Thank you very much.
I think Netflix is really overrated.
It is, isn't it? Apart from they've got some good documentaries, but we do, like Netflix, though, we do rely on subscriptions, even though it's very voluntary. So if you do want to make Novara Media sustainable, help us grow, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. On Monday's show, the issue of the effectiveness of rioting as a strategy came up. Me and Aaron took slightly different positions. It even got a bit shirty. A couple of people messaged me to say, are you and Aaron all right? And I say, yeah, of course, we love having a little bicker and an argument on screen. It helps us, develop our politics. But I think because we hadn't prepared it, it could have been better structured. So we're going to revisit it today because it's such an interesting question. The idea, not are riots morally justified, because we both agree that, the biggest problem in America right now is not people smashing windows. It's the police killing innocent people. But we'll debate that in a moment. First of all, I want to look at a couple of clips of the first one. Is America's most famous civil rights activist speaking in 1966.
I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years.
How many summers like this one do you imagine that we can expect?
Well, I would say this, we don't have long. The mood of the Negro community now is one of urgency, one of saying that we aren't going to wait, that we've got to have our freedom. We've waited too long. So that I would say that every summer we are going to have this kind of vigorous protest. My hope is that it will be nonviolent. I would hope that we can avoid riots because riots are self-defeating and socially destructive. I would hope that we can avoid riots, but that we will be as militant and as determined next summer and through the winter as we have been this summer. And I think the answer about how long it will take will depend on the federal government, on the city halls of our various cities, and on white America to a large extent. This is where we are at this point, and I think white America will determine how long it will be and which way we go in the future.
So the argument there, riots are the language of the unheard. He's not in any mood to condemn rioters, but at the same time, he's saying that, in his view, the most strategic thing to do, the best way to get positive outcomes is non-violent civil disobedience. We are now going to go to a sort of a modern parallel with that speech, which was Ilhan Omar. She currently represents Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd was murdered. Here she is speaking on Saturday.
Every single fire set ablaze, every single store that is looted, every time our community finds itself in danger, it is time where people are not spending talking about getting justice for George Floyd and many of the lives that have been lost in our community. But I also want to be clear, because we have to remember what escalated this situation. The tear gas that was shot into the crowd of children and the disproportionate response. We keep finding ourselves again in these positions. So I realize that our frustrations are warranted. Our despair is justified. But today our priority needs to be to minimize harm. We can't let the violence committed against one black man give way to more destruction. You can't say you care about black lives and engage in fires that endanger black lives.
So we're going to sort of debate the strategic usefulness of riots in a moment, first of all. And to be honest, I think that the jury's out, and I think it probably is completely context dependent, and sometimes riots get good outcomes and sometimes they get bad outcomes. But I want to first present to you a bit of research by Omar Wasow. This has been widely shared because it came out about a month ago, a very prescient time, which is how 1960s black protests moved elite public opinion and voting. It was in the American Political Science Review, and it is arguing basically that nonviolent civil disobedience in the 1960s was very good at moving political gravity towards expansion of civil rights. And then when riots occurred, that had some role in shifting political discourse to the right and strengthening those who are arguing for law and order. Let's go through just some of the key bits of evidence that Omar Wasow deploys. So this is the first one. So he's looking at nonviolent protest activity, headlines, and public opinion on civil rights by month. And you can see there on the purple line, you can see sort of in 1963, you have the highest number of nonviolent protesters, that's the March on Washington. And then you get a huge spike in the number of people who say that civil rights is the most important issue facing America at that time. So we often see that kind of polling. That sort of gradually goes down, but it spikes when you get big nonviolent protests or when civil rights get in the headlines. Then we move to the second half. And obviously, actually, I should point out that Lyndon Johnson is re-elected in 1964 after signing the Civil Rights Act. Then in the second half of the 60s, when riots become more frequent, social control becomes increasingly important as a concern for voters. So can we go to the next graphic? So here we've got violent protest activity, headlines on riots, and public opinion on social control. So you see there in 1968, you get, in 1967, you get a big spike in violent protest arrests. And at the same time, you get a big spike in public opinion, or people saying that social control is the most important issue facing America. It goes to above 40 and remains quite high. It keeps going up as you see again those riots in 1968, which was actually after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and concern about social control spikes again. Now, Omar Wasow uses this to suggest that rioting was critical to Nixon, Richard Nixon winning the presidency in 1968. He looks at counties where riots were close by and counties where riots didn't happen, and suggests that those that were near an uprising saw a 1.6 to 1.8 percentage point decrease in voting support for Democratic presidential candidates. Obviously, Nixon's war on drugs was then an enormous counter-reaction to all the gains made during the civil rights movement. Incarceration rockets after that. And obviously, this is, I should absolutely clarify, this is not to blame any kind of black radicalism for the war on drugs. The fault of that is Richard Nixon and lots of racist white people in the United States. This is not a moral question. It's purely a strategic one. I do have a bit of evidence that says the opposite, but first I want to go to you, Aaron. What do you make of this?
I don't agree with it.
Why?
Well, if you look at the 1968 presidential election, excuse me, there was a third-party candidate who was basically running on a pro-segregationist position. He got 9 million votes, and still Nixon won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College by 100. So if he just pipped it in a two-horse race, fine. But Nixon won in the context of actually, I think to this day he was the most effective third-party candidate. Maybe Ralph Nader, but I mean, as a percentage of the overall electorate, 9 million in 1968 was huge. He took several states. George something, maybe because somebody can pull this up. George Wallace, American Independent, based in Alabama. So the context here is the end of segregation. It was a revolution for half the United States, and that there was the rise of the Dixiecrat. The rise of the and this is a slow thing. This starts before actually the Civil Rights Act of right-leaning conservative Democrats in the South. They run against the Democrats initially. Or they leave the Democratic Party. By 68, many of them have joined the Republicans. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think it's a bit more nuanced than some riots happened. It was about large numbers of African Americans moving to northern states. It was about the end of segregation. It was about the Southern strategy with Nixon changing a lot of those core dynamics. So I mean, I don't quite buy that argument. I would say that it's certainly the case that riots in the short term tend to embolden and empower authoritarians. I mean, we agree on that. A great example is 1968 and Charles de Gaulle. He briefly left the country. It looked like it could be existential for his government, and he came back all guns blazing and won a seismic electoral win not long after. Margaret Thatcher, you have riots in the early 1980s, 81. You have what seems like a really volatile political situation in Britain. 1983, she gets a really big electoral breakthrough. So I agree with you. I just don't think 1960. I think Nixon would have won 1968 anyway because of what was happening to the Southern Democratic vote. And because Lyndon Johnson or the Democrats after 64, 65 take a huge hit over the Civil Rights Act. They were a bit like Labour with Brexit in the last election. Okay, do we want to lose our urban northern seats? Do we want to lose our sort of southern, sort of what became Dixiecrat seats, sort of previously Confederate slave-owning seats? We call them seats. They call them states. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Although we do agree. I think generally speaking, in the short term at least, riots are not good if you want to win a general election. But then the question is, do they have other effects? Look at the poll tax riot in Britain. It was 1990, 91. The Tories then go on to win the next general election. Sure, but the poll tax doesn't happen. So or in this instance, George Floyd, would these police officers be facing criminal prosecution if these riots hadn't happened? I mean, I would argue probably not. I've seen other people make that argument. I mean, we don't know. However, this is playing out in a different way to previous cases, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and so on. So, it's a complex picture.
I mean, they definitely wouldn't. I mean, they definitely would not have been convicted and prosecuted. Well, they haven't been convicted yet, but they wouldn't have been prosecuted, the people who killed George Floyd, if it weren't for huge mobilizations. The question is just whether it's more strategic for them to be violent or non-violent. I agree with you. The jury's out. What I'd say about 1968 is that marginal effects in presidential elections can be incredibly consequential. But I just want to go to. There's also one piece of which, bizarrely in a way, came out in the same journal, the American Review of Political Science. Can protest change local policy support? Evidence from the aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles riot. And they come to the complete opposite conclusion. So that was huge riots in Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King, and the police were let off. Extraordinary event, awful. It's good. Actually, we've just trashed Netflix, but there's a very good documentary on Netflix about it called LA 92. And they show that immediately after the riots, voter registration increased among people who lived closer to the riots, and that these new voters, both black and white, shifted policy in a progressive direction. And I mean, this does make sense that you get, a riot happens and suddenly an issue which was ignored is no longer ignored. And you can often have people who, you might have seen a similar thing in London, actually, where people wake up to the fact that you do actually have to invest in inner city areas. So it can be a cry for help that actually gets heard by progressives in the country. So in a way, we agree the jury's out, but I thought we should come back to this particular debate with a little bit of evidence. And when we, both knew what we were talking about. The conclusion, though, I'm afraid, is who knows. We are going to go to Aaron. Do you want to say anything on this before we go to our final section?
I mean, yeah, again, it's about how do you measure these things, right? You're measuring quite abstract things, quite hard to measure. If you look at the student movement in this country in 2010, 2011, it failed to stop an increase in tuition fees. However, all those people in the process of being politicized through that protest movement, which included things which bordered on riot at times, many of those people then, enter, for instance, the Labour Party. They change the politics of the Labour Party. So they help somebody win, somebody become the party leader who never normally would have become the party leader. And so these sedimentary effects of a major riot or a protest, often there can be overlap between the two, or a strike, which might fail, but then it has these after effects. Another one is, I'll finish with this, the 1848 revolutions. In Germany, it was a failure. But many of the revolutionaries of 1848 go to other countries, including the United States, and then their activism, that would be the modern word for it, changes those, those countries' politics. On the battlefield at Gettysburg, there were senior officers in the Unionist army who were emigres from Germany who'd been 1848 revolutionaries, who believed in the universal rights of human beings. And so, yeah, these after effects of contentious episodes in politics, it can be difficult to measure. That said, we should still have measurables. You should still want electoral success. You shouldn't try and sort of take the false premise that, okay, well, we lost this thing, but actually we secretly won because there's this thing we can't measure in it. That's okay. I'm not suggesting that. But sometimes you can have unforeseen after effects, which actually are very significant.
Okay, well, finally, we're going to go to Juliet Jacques for a interview, because it has been 10 years since Juliet started writing her Transgender Journeys series in The Guardian. I went back to it after Juliet pointed out this decade anniversary had come along. It's very sort of powerful, informative, very personal account, actually, of your transition a decade ago. And I suppose I really recommend going to check it out. But I wanted to start by, I suppose, saying what has changed in those 10 years. So you're obviously writing that in The Guardian, which itself has become a bit of a point where many of these debates occur. And to me, I suppose from an outsider, these debates in a way, it seems that trans lives and trans issues have become way more visible in the past decade, but also the amount of organized hostility seems to have dramatically increased as well. So I wanted to start by sort of asking you your thoughts on what's changed over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's about the size of it. When I started writing the series I started writing it in 2009. It started running in 2010. I did it because The Guardian actually had a pretty poor record on trans issues. They didn't cover trans issues very much. But when they did, for example, around the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, it was often done in a way that was quite hostile. The lesbian feminist journalist Judy Bindel wrote a notorious piece for The Guardian in 2004 that got, I think, about 200 complaints. And a few years later, when she was nominated for the Stonewall Journalist of the Year award, that ceremony was picketed by trans activists. So there was a lot of contention around The Guardian in particular as a place that was, as the sort of liberal bastion of British media, you would maybe expect to be covering trans issues more sympathetically than, say, the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or the Times or somewhere. And it wasn't. So the column I did was really an attempt to bring the subject sort of into the mainstream, but have trans writers setting the terms for discussion. What The Guardian would often do would be to commission a comment piece by a sort of hostile commentator and then give a trans writer a right of reply, but it meant we were always like answering to the terms set by other people. The point with the column was to try and set the terms ourselves and to use this kind of personal journey story as a Trojan horse, really, to bring in lots of other issues that hooked onto my transition. So yes, I was talking about my personal transition, but I was also talking about the state of healthcare. I was also talking about the employment issues for trans people. We had the Sex Discrimination Act amendment in 1999 that made it illegal for employers to sack people for transitioning at work, but there was nothing really to stop employers just not employing trans people at the interview stage if they didn't want to. There've been a number of these kind of legal gains, and people were very, very concerned about how we were represented in the media. So one of the things I think the series did achieve was to show section editors, cultural gatekeepers, television commissioners, that the public actually was interested in hearing trans people talk about trans issues in our own voices, and it wasn't too complicated for them, it wasn't too difficult for them. Actually, the public were very interested. There was an audience ready to receive that. And, you know, my work plugged into this point where lots of trans writers, creatives, activist groups, organizations realized that the media was doing us an awful lot of damage. You know, we were the butt of jokes in comedy shows all the time. We were being portrayed as like freaks and weirdos from one side and as these kind of ultimate gender conformists on the other. There are all these double binds for us that we were trying to break down. And to do that took time. It would take a lot of space in the media. So lots of us tried to secure regular spaces in relatively mainstream publications and try and sort of open people's eyes to how the media was treating us and how that treatment was obscuring a lot of the issues in trans lives that need to be talked about, the sort of violence and institutional and social hostility and prejudices that we faced. This was fairly successful, I think, in the first few years of the 2010s, I think with some very significant setbacks, both in the UK and the US. But by 2014, you had a number of trans and non-binary like writers, journalists, critics, starting to make some headway in publications, at least liberal publications like The Guardian, The New Statesman. Of course, famously in the US, you have that transgender tipping point article and cover where Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black is on the cover of Time magazine, I think May 2014. And there's an article about how apparently, you know, the trans rights movement is something that now has reached this tipping point and cannot be stopped. And unfortunately, it tipped back the other way. And I think all over the world, there was organized reaction and resistance to trans organization. As you say, previously it had been like a handful of individual journalists really who had distaste for trans people, shall we say, as a pet subject for them. And it became a lot more organized. Organizations calling themselves gender critical were formed quite a lot more in the States and the UK and elsewhere. Whenever I hear the phrase gender critical, I always think of Alan Partridge describing himself as homo skeptic, but maybe that's just me. But there was sort of more organized institutional kickback against us in lots of different places. So obviously in Russia, you get the gay propaganda law in 2013, which, you know, basically seeks to outlaw any public expression of LGBT identities. There's an attempt to copy this almost word for word in Kyrgyzstan, which doesn't make it through the Kyrgyz parliament, but leads to a real kind of chilling of LGBT visibility there. In Hungary, Viktor Orban bans gender studies from Hungarian universities. In Poland, there's an attempt to outlaw the word gender or gender from the language entirely. In Turkey, there are attacks on LGBT people and LGBT visibility, which particularly focuses on a lot of trans sex workers around Istiklal in Istanbul. In Brazil, there are a lot of attacks on LGBT plus people, and there's a particular opprobrium directed towards Judith Butler, who of course is the most prominent, probably trans feminist theorist and philosopher. In the States, there is an attempt by Donald Trump to stop trans people serving in the military. I think it's partly a reaction against Chelsea Manning, but it's also an attempt to divide trans people from lesbian, gay and bi people, and to use that as a thin end of the wedge against LGBT rights more generally. And, the Trump administration also talked about legally defining gender as the gender you were born at, gender you're assigned at birth.
Do you see all of this as a kind of inevitable backlash to when progress gets made, or is this something that sort of surprised you? And I suppose the argument where is it an inevitable backlash also implies that we'll move beyond this. It's a short term. There were huge gains made. Then you get a really, well, that puts rocket boosters under the momentum for the reactionaries on this particular issue, and then ultimately you overcome it. I mean, are you positive that that's going to be the direction of travel, or am I being a bit too Hegelian about all of this?
I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I very much subscribe to radical models of history that suggest that, you don't have linear progress, you have victories and defeats, and generations have to fight the same battle again and again. Certainly, I would say that the way the British media have been covering trans issues over the last 10 years looks very, very much like how they were covering gay and lesbian issues in the 1980s, which of course led to Section 28, which had a chilling effect on a whole generation of British school children. Something similar is happening now. Like Liz Truss is talking about reviewing the Gender Recognition Act from 2004. There was a consultation in 2018 that stalled largely in the face of quite considerable hostility from the press and from organisations, including The Guardian, who kind of both sides the issue in an editorial that the American Guardian subsequently disowned. It's a pretty extraordinary media moment. But, right now it does look like we are facing an organised backlash that has come specifically because of the gains we made in the first half of the decade. Now, I do feel that in lots of other forms of media, new media have been very good on trans issues. The New Socialist have been great on this. Tribune published a big piece on the Labour campaign for trans rights, and several of Tribune's editors, Owen Hatherley, Marcus Barnett, came out very strongly in favour of trans rights recently. And, obviously a certain younger publications, so we say even things like Vice have been much more trans positive. Trans people are much more visible in mainstream media and films. Visibility isn't everything. Of course, we need to be politically much more organised. But I mean, with these mainstream publications that are doing us a lot of damage, a lot of the time it really is just down to the whim of one or two individual editors. So I think when those people get replaced by someone younger, then there probably will be a volte-face and maybe some sort of apology. And I think a lot of people will be quite embarrassed by the things they allow to be published about trans and non-binary people in the 2010s. That's my hope, anyway.
And finally, I know that your series was about medically transitioning. And one of the things that seems to be happening from, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, or however you want to call them, is an attempt to basically divide people who have medically transitioned from people who have transitioned socially. And to say, look, we're not actually transphobic. We're just against people saying they're of a different sex to which they were assigned at birth without having the operation, or without, however they define the dividing line whereby they'll accept that someone is the gender they say they are. And I wondered, as someone who's written about that medical transition, have you noticed that attempt to sort of divide the trans community work at all, or has it just fallen flat on its face, this idea to say that you're a legitimate trans person and these people aren't legitimate trans people?
I mean, that division has very much existed in what we would call the trans community going back to the 1960s at least. You could sort of joke and say you put two trans people in a room and you'll have like 3 different opinions and 4 different identities. So that division was there to be exploited. Again, this is something where I see hope in younger people, really. A lot of the commentators who are doing this are people in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Younger generation I see coming up now, people in their 20s and 30s, realise a lot more that it makes much more sense to be united around shared oppressions than to allow ourselves to be divided by our enemies. The best summation I ever heard of this was at a talk I did, I think, when I started doing the series, or not long after, maybe 2011, and somebody raised this kind of issue around divisions between LGBT and T people and then different subsets of the trans community, and said, look, you have all these differences. Why would you want to unite yourself and erase those differences? And before I could answer, someone in the audience just said, look, we all get beaten up by the same people. And it is that simple.
Juliet, thank you so much for talking to us this evening. And you can find Juliet's work by, well, I mean, I just Googled Guardian Juliet Jacques. I mean, it probably isn't.
Yeah, I mean,
a more efficient way to get there. But you've done
all of my work is at julietjacques.com, so you can go there.
Perfect. That is more efficient. And you can listen to Suite 212, which is Juliet's brilliant podcast on culture. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening.
Thanks.
We got Aaron still here, or I think we're going to wrap up now anyway, I suppose. Any comments before we go, Aaron?
No, it was great to have that conversation with her. It's something, I think you're very good at this, Michael, is that, and we need you to do this stuff more often, is there's a lot of misunderstanding around these issues, even within the left. And I think I view you as a conduit for political education, Michael.
I'll take that. Aaron Bastani, a pleasure as always. Thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then please do go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Monday, so do be sure to hit subscribe. Have a great weekend. You've been watching Tiski Sour. Good night.